Bonjour, on vous propose un entretien aujourd'hui qu'on a tourné avec un historien qui s'appelle Andrés Reséndez et qui a consacré une partie de ses recherches au thème de la traite de l'esclavage des Amérindiens et en particulier des Nord-Amérindiens en Amérique du Nord. On est super heureux de vous proposer ce contenu aujourd'hui parce que c'est pas un thème qui est très abordé en règle générale. On parle parfois un peu de l'esclavage des Amérindiens d'Amérique du Sud, mais pas beaucoup de celui des Amérindiens du Nord, il nous semble. Si vous souhaitez, vous allez voir, la vidéo est très riche en informations, mais si vous souhaitez en savoir plus, il y a le livre d'Andrés Reséndez qui s'appelle L'autre esclavage, qui a été traduit l'an dernier en 2021 en français. Donc vraiment, vous pouvez foncer, il est super intéressant. Et de notre côté, voilà, c'est un nouveau format de vidéo, donc n'hésitez pas à nous dire si ça vous plaît. Et dans tous les cas, on vous souhaite d'excellentes fêtes de fin d'année. À bientôt.
Well, back in 2009, I had just published a previous book about a European expedition that landed in Florida in the 1530s, 20s and 30s. And it was a disaster. Only three Europeans and one African survived, and they were held by indigenous groups on what is now the coast of Texas for a period of 6 years. And so, in fleshing out that story, I became interested in okay, so what does it mean to be enslaved by natives? And so I started reading this literature, and that piqued my interest. And then these four survivors basically became medicine men and started walking towards the European controlled area. So at the time, this is very early in the colonization period. So all of this was Indian territory, but there were a few areas. And these survivors, the first thing they ran into was a detachment, a cavalry detachment of Spain, who were moving north from Mexico City into this region, and they were in the business of taking natives captive. So that sparked an interest in okay, so this was the cutting edge of European colonization in the New World was through this business of captivity. And so that's what sparked the idea for the book that eventually became The Other Slavery. Sure. I mean, slavery was a worldwide phenomenon. You could find it everywhere in the world, and surely the Americas were no exception to this. What's really so you have many examples of this, and I'm sure some of your listeners will be very familiar with them. So, Aztecs and Mayas took captives to use in ceremonies of human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism. um, Iroquois people in what is now the American Northeast waged what were known as mourning wars. That is, wars meant to capture people from neighboring groups in order to replace deceased people in their own group. And in the American West, for example, close to where I live in California, and further north, indigenous peoples, prior to European contact, sealed elite marriage deals by exchanging slaves. So these were practices that were very common all over the continent. Um, but um, but they were embedded in specific cultural contexts. I mean, all of these things that we are talking about was captivity in very specific cultural understandings. And what changed with the arrival of Europeans is that first, these practices became commodified. They became part of they became transactions, so they became unmoored from their particular cultural settings, and they grew in scope. So whereas practices of captivity and enslavement were more localized and regionalized in the aftermath of the arrival of Europeans, they came to encompass networks on a far greater scale than it would have been possible before. And just let me give you an example or two. Apaches, for example, in what is now northern Mexico and the American Southwest, were shipped as far as the island of Cuba in the aftermath of European colonization. or islanders from what is now the Philippines were shipped all the way to the silver mines in northern Mexico. So again, these networks of enslavement would have been unthinkable before the arrival of Europeans. I think, of course, traditionally, when people in the Americas in general, in the United States in particular, talk about slavery, they immediately imagine African slavery. They immediately imagine these 12.5 Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Indian slavery is really not part of the conversation, or at least not until recently. I think things are beginning to change in the last 2 decades, or maybe a little bit more. There has been a flurry of studies about Indian slavery in various parts of the Americas. And so that is giving us a clearer picture. In terms of numbers, the number of indigenous victims of enslavement is smaller than that 12.5 million. I try to make an estimate in my book, and I come up with something like 2.5 to 5 million natives enslaved between the arrival of Columbus and 1900, when these institutions kind of declined. So that may not sound like a lot, but it is. In some regions, it led to complete decimation, and so it is a very significant phenomenon. And I think the reason why we don't talk more about Indian slavery is because of the record, the historical record, whereas African slavery was legal from the very beginning, and therefore we have all these records in wills and bills of sale, and of course we have the port records. They had to be transported from Africa to the New World, and so we have the numbers of those port records or ship records. In the case of Indian slavery, we have a more regionalized series of markets. And so we don't have, and it was illegal to begin with. So people really didn't want to talk about it. They couldn't legally sell them, at least in the Spanish context, for a long time. And so this has led to the perception that it was not such a big deal as African slavery. Yet, as I try to show in my book, in relative terms and in terms of contribution to the economy, in terms of sheer devastation, Indian slavery was every bit as terrible, as devastating as African slavery. Well, I mean, one obvious difference is just sheer, when you look at these two groups, 12.5 versus 5 million at the highest level. There's one demographic aspect that is really salient, and that is the composition of these two groups. So of those 12.5 million, the majority were adult males. There were women and children, of course, African women and children enslaved, but the majority were adult males, and that's because of the economic activities to which these slaves were destined in plantations, etc., and initially in other concerns. In the case of Indian slavery, it targeted primarily women and children. So it's like the mirror opposite of African slavery. So that's one very big distinction. And the other distinction, which I go into great depth in my book, has to do precisely with what you were mentioning, the legality versus the illegality. Because it was illegal, then people had to go about in different ways to maintain. So basically, the long story short is that Indian slavery was legal in the early decades of European colonization, at least in the case of the Spanish, and it was also the case in the English and the French. So So it was legal in the case of the Spanish between Columbus and the middle of the 16th century for 50 years. And the entire economy of the New World was based on coerced Indian labor. And then because of concerns, religious concerns, etc., the Spanish monarchy decided to abolish Indian slavery with the so-called New Laws of 1542. And of course, that was a very generous sentiment, but it was practically impossible in the New World where everything really depended on this coerced Indian labor. So owners in the New World, in order to maintain their slaves, resorted to all kinds of legal subterfuges and alternative terms to get around this prohibition and continue to coerce natives to work. And so that's another reason. That's why that's another explanation of why this other slavery, as I call it, is so invisible, and it is another reason why this other slavery it lasted longer than African slavery, because while African slavery was formally abolished because it was legal, etc., Indian slavery, since it theoretically should not have existed, it was not abolished. Well, I mean, there were a few. I mean, well, in the 19th century, there were attempts to stamp this out. But so that's another very important difference between these two slaveries. So it is interesting. The role of the church in slavery is just fascinating, right? Because I mean, we could go back to the 15th century and how papal bulls, papal orders to Portugal in the 1440s, for example, were constituted one of the justifications for African slavery. In the case of Indian slavery, the papacy early on had some qualms about, and not just the Pope, but also the Spanish monarchy had qualms about whether it was legal to enslave Indians. So in Europe, the institution of slavery was pretty well established in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially in the Iberian Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula. So you could see slave markets where people from Africa, but also people from the Eastern Mediterranean were arriving and they were being sold. Before they could be legally sold in these markets, European officials had to make sure that these slaves were proper slaves, that they had not been kidnapped and sold illegally as slaves. And so, and that meant that that these slaves had to be against the European nations and against Christianity. That was one way to determine that. And in the case of Native Americans, it was unclear whether they were waging an offensive war against Europe. In fact, we know that they weren't. It was quite the opposite. And it was unclear whether they were anti-Christian, because many of them were actually converting to Christianity. So both the Spanish crown and the Pope had some serious concerns about whether Native Americans were actually enslavable in the same way that Africans, many of whom were Muslim, for example, and they were eminently enslavable. So finally, the Pope in 1537 decided that it was not okay to enslave Native Americans, and the Spanish crown followed suit, as we discussed in 1542 with the new laws. So that's both the papacy and the Spanish crown decided to go against enslaving Native Americans, but that could not change the facts on the ground, and that is that everything ran on coerced Indian labor in the New World. There were differences, of course. So after the passage of the new laws, as we say, in the middle of the 16th century, theoretically, you could use the Spanish legal system to reverse or to prevent you to seek your freedom, basically. But of course, this applied only if you were a Christianized Native American and you were a Hispanicized Native American. Basically, what happened in some parts, for example, in frontier regions of the New World, for example, what is now the north of Mexico and the American Southwest, what we have were native groups who were nomadic and semi-nomadic, who were completely outside of this Spanish legal system, and entrepreneurial people, enslave natives by essentially finding crimes. So, for example, governors in New Mexico declared that the Apache Nation was barbarous and was guilty of many crimes. And so it became legal to seize some of these Apaches and take them to the legal system. So the technicality there that was that these Apaches were not taken as slaves; they were simply criminals. And once they were judged, they were sentenced to 5, 10, 20 years of forced labor, and thus that service was sold. So it's not as if they were enslaved. That was the legal justification. They were not enslaved. They were just criminals serving out their sentences, which could be sold to to various neighbors in the region. Indian slavery was practiced all over the hemisphere. In the book, I have a chapter where the Spanish king goes into an anti-slavery crusade in the late 17th century. So, more than 150 years after, after these events that we're talking about. And he was shocked to receive reports from South America, from places like Chile about enslavement, from places like Peru, from places like Argentina, from places like the Philippines, which was a Spanish possession, from places like Central America and from the Caribbean and from, northern Mexico and what is now the American Southwest. So it was really a hemispheric phenomenon. And of course, it also was practiced not just by the Spanish crown, but also by other European empires in the New World. So I know that, so there is great work. For example, Brett Rushforth, who's a professor at the University of Oregon, has a few years ago published a book about the phenomenon of Indian slavery in New France and how some of these natives, thousands of natives were brought from what is now the Great Lakes region, and they were taken to what is now Eastern Canada and, were enslaved there. We also know some of these Apaches. There was a book published just this year by Paul Conrad about Apaches, and he shows that Apaches. I was telling you that Apaches was one of the nations that was worst affected by this phenomenon, and they were dispersed. Some of them wound up in Cuba, as we were saying earlier, but some of them wound up in Eastern Canada, in French-speaking Canada as well. So again, so it was practiced by French colonists as well, in collusion with native allies who also participated in the traffic of other Native Americans. And of course, the same thing goes for the English colonies in the New World. So there is great work, for example, about the Carolinas, about Florida, even in New England, where many natives who live there were shipped off to the Caribbean islands to be sold as slaves. So it was a pan-continental phenomenon, and everybody did it. The French, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, everybody who could do it. And of course, some native groups did it to other native groups as well. At first, we've said how slavery existed in the New World prior to the arrival of Europeans. But with the arrival of Europeans, these practices became commodified and increased in scope, as we were saying. At first, Native Americans served as auxiliaries or as helpers in these networks. So they sold They became junior partners, they became guards, they became guides, etc., to the Europeans who had, after all, were far more lethal with their firearms and with their horses. But with the passage of time, Native Americans acquired firearms and horses, and some of them made inroads into this business that had been controlled in the 16th and 17th centuries by Europeans. And so we have some groups, again, all over the Americas, that became equestrian powers or became powers and became suppliers of goods of all kinds, including humans. And so the best cases that I include in the book are Comanches and Utes, two very powerful confederations, indigenous confederations. Comanches, in particular, for example, became preeminent providers of Indian slaves to the Spanish, to the English, to the French, as well as to other indigenous groups. And Utes, for example, they would procure natives from what is now the Great Basin, and adjacent to California or in California, Utah, this area, and they would take them to sell them in fairs in New Mexico. So, and the same thing goes, for example, in the Caribbean. The Carib Indians pretty much serve the same function, selling slaves to the Dutch, for example. So it is, but it is fascinating that how some of these native groups who had been victims of European enslavement kind of turned the tables around and became. At the same time that they were victims, they became a part of the business, and that was the best way to survive. So it is one of the hardest things to wrap our minds around, how they were both victims and perpetrators at the same time. So I would say that you are totally right. So in fact, if we look at a place like New Mexico, for example, and a place, a people like the Comanches, to use an example that we were discussing, they were capturing Mexicans from northern Mexico. So Comanches were making incursions deep into what is now Mexico, and they were taking Mexicans. They were making captives from Apaches, for example. They were, and occasionally they made captives of Americans and other Europeans, Germans. So it is easy to say that it was just a business. However, I would say that the vast majority were people of indigenous extraction. So there's a racial element. In the same way that African slavery targeted, it was tied to a particular skin color. Indian slavery, although it affected other groups, it also had a racial component. It worked in lockstep. So it affected disproportionately Native Americans. That's what I'm trying to get at with this. Even though some Europeans, some Euro-Americans were also, victims of these widespread system that we've been talking about. Absolutely. So as I was saying, so for example, the clearest example of this, the most dramatic example of this, is the relationship between Utes and Paiutes. So Utes were these, both of these peoples were related linguistically and, in terms of genetically further back in time. Yet they evolved into very different trajectories. So the Utes who lived to the northwest of the New Mexican settlements, they acquired horses, they acquired firearms, and they grew into this equestrian power. The Paiutes lived farther west in the Great Basin, which is a very difficult and environmentally difficult. So it has less food, And so people that Paiutes lived in small family units, that could range between 10 and 20 and 30. They did not have horses because having horses lived on grass, which was the food of the Paiutes themselves. So having horses meant that they were eating your food. So instead of having horses, Paiutes often killed them and ate them rather than domesticating them like the Utes because of environmental reasons, because it made more sense in terms of how they survived and they lived. And so here you have two related peoples, one that acquired all these trappings, all these new technologies of warfare, like firearms and horses, and another people that survived in the best way they could, and they killed their horses. These were horseless people. They were often derogatorily referred to as digger Indians because they were digging for roots, etc., to survive. And so what we have eventually in the 19th century is these very contrasting relationship between the two, in which Utes would every year ride down from where they lived in Colorado, etc., right down into the Great Basin, especially in the spring when Paiutes were at their weakest. That was the time when there was less food, and they would, basically harvest slaves that the Utes would take back to New Mexico to sell as slaves. So this is how these phenomenon affected relationships between groups, as you were asking. For Comanches, slaves were an incredibly versatile commodity because they could be they could be absorbed into their own society. So Comanches absorbed especially women and children. Women became secondary wives, for example, and they became very important in the processing of the hide trade. Children were also incorporated into Comanche society, adopted, often used to care for mares and horses that their herds grew at this time. So they were incorporated, but they could also. So that was a portion of them. So there we have many witness records of Europeans visiting Comanche encampments and seeing many of these captives. So we have those records. We also know that Comanches sold another portion of these slaves to other Europeans or to other indigenous groups. Or they could, for example, if some Comanche men or women were captured by other indigenous groups, they could use captives in order to trade. So they could be used as pawns in order to exchange, to recover lost relatives, etc. So human captives were incredibly versatile. They were the most common form of payment in a region that lacked any silver or any other. There were other ways of payment, but this was one very important way of transacting. Just exchanging humans was a very compelling, very versatile form of exchange. I am especially interested in the case of the Caribbean for this. So the Caribbean, well, that was the people who Columbus met first, the people of the Caribbeans, in 1492, and within 50 or 60 years, these population had been reduced to small groups of survivors. So the economic and the demographic catastrophe is not in question. There are different numbers. We can argue about the numbers, etc., but the catastrophe is not in question. And so typically, as you say, we tend to blame epidemics. But if you look at the historical record, there are relatively few mentions of epidemics, especially in the first, up until 15, 17, 18, etc. So for the first 25 years, there are there are some mentions of epidemics, but nothing that would suggest a pandemic in the same way that we are experiencing today, and which would have been recorded. After that, we do have reports like that. But in that, if you look carefully at that first 25 years, especially in a place like Hispaniola, which is the large island that today is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, you see that there is a precipitous decline of people from the time of Columbus to before the arrival of these pandemics, that they were a factor, but they came to deliver the coup de grace, so to speak, to a population that was already in dramatic decline. So I look at the Spanish censuses, and these censuses, you may argue that they were not all that accurate, but these censuses do point to very dramatic reductions of 80 or 90%, before the arrival of epidemics. And what we know of in the historical record is that these large island had the largest gold deposits. And so we know what went on in terms of the economy. So basically, European prospectors went to these areas. They needed indigenous labor to extract this gold. So this was the first gold rush of the American continent, predating the California gold rush by hundreds of years. And we know that by the records that the mortality rates were pretty high. And we also know that this population, once it dwindled, the population of Hispaniola really declined dramatically in the first 10 years, from 1500 to 1510. And in the aftermath of that, what we have is the removal of indigenous peoples from neighboring islands, bringing them into the gold fields of Hispaniola, and also Puerto Rico and Cuba. They also found gold there. So we have the spread of these demographic decline from the large islands where they found gold to the small islands that became practically depopulated. And again, it's not as if it's either epidemics or slavery, but the two work side by side. There was a synergistic relationship between the two. Because epidemics killed people, you needed to replace those workers. And therefore, that gave incentives to the slavers to go out and get some more native slaves in order to replenish the dead workers. And of course, in conducting these expeditions, you are spreading germs and further killing indigenous people. So actually, the two, epidemics and slavery, worked hand in hand. And there's similar work. For example, Paul Kelton has published work on what is now the southeastern part of the United States, showing similar synergistic relationship between epidemics and slavery. So it was a very common. And so I think we tend to overplay the biology, but what we know now that we're living in this pandemic is that man-made decisions also matter greatly. It's not just a biological fact that occurs everywhere and at the same rate. It really is mediated by our own actions. And you can imagine, if you are suffering from an epidemic, but also you are being attacked and enslaved, that would be a double whammy that proved lethal in many cases for many of these communities. No, it was a wide phenomenon. So by the 19th century, the American army, as well, had to wrestle with what they call the Indian problem, and many of these officers came to the conclusion that the only way to deal with the Indian problem in the West was to settle nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples into specific locations. So the reservation idea. Navajos. So this is in the 1860s, as the Civil War is unfolding in the East. In the West, what we have is, a kind of an amassing of military force, but basically they were not actively fighting for much of the Civil War. They were just expecting the results from the East. And so in order to become useful in a place like New Mexico, these American military decided to wage war to fix the Indian problem, and the Navajos, being one of the most active peoples, became the target of this campaign. And so, as you say, they were moved from Cañon de Shea, where they used to reside, to the Bosque Redondo reservation in what is now eastern New Mexico. For that, there were many other groups involved in this effort to, to transport, as you were saying, or to move the Navajo nation from the canyon, from their homeland in the canyon, to eastern New Mexico. And in this forced removal, what we have is an incredible opportunity to enslave. So we have, first of all, other indigenous groups who were acting as auxiliaries, as guides, etc., to the in this campaign against the Navajos, and they wanted to be paid in slaves. And you also have Spanish-speaking auxiliaries who also who participated in these forcible removal, and they also wanted to be paid in slaves. So this removal of natives resulted in an upsurge of slaves in New Mexico, and you can see that in the baptismal records. So in the 1860s, you have an incredible spike of Navajo children and women, etc., being baptized in New Mexico, and that only means that they were being taken from Navajo lands and they were being sold, and therefore they were being registered into the church as servants, etc. Well, I mean, I would say it's not a question of either or. I mean, I'm sure there was a range of opinion. From the 16th century onwards, all the way to the 19th century that you're referring to these schools, there was a clear idea that Native Americans would be better off not as pagans, but as Christians, and that they needed to be educated. Everybody, Euro-Americans universally believe that. But however, given the legal situation of slavery, this was one way to get around the legal prohibition against enslavement. So this was one way to obtain coerced labor. And children were especially targeted because they could learn languages quickly, they could adapt to new circumstances quickly, and they could even in the fullness of time identify with the society that had captured them. And ultimately some of them became incorporated into these societies. So the idea of education and enslavement always had been hand in hand since the 16th century. This is what if you look at 16th century conquistadors, they were saying, yeah, we are capturing them because we want to Christianize them and educate them. And the same thing goes for Mormons in the 19th century. They are Mormons who established themselves in the Salt Lake region. They were also buying natives from the Great Basin that were being offered by Utes, for example, amongst others. And they found a way to rationalize these purchases by saying that, yeah, we want to turn them into white and delightsome people. So it was exactly the same argument that had been used for centuries by other Euro-Americans. Well, that's a very good question, which I in my book I don't really look at the schools. But I do deal with the problem of how do we define Indian slavery, or the other slavery, as I call it, and I recognize that it is very difficult to define it properly because there was such a range of coercive labor regimes to which these Native Americans were subjected to. So if I define it in one very specific way, I'm going to leave out many other forms of coercion. So the best I could do was to come up with 4 characteristics that define the other slavery, as I call it. So one was the relocation from one place to another that was far away, and that applied to the overwhelming majority of the other slavery, because of course if you took Indians from a nearby place, if you were the owner, you opened yourself to attack from the relatives of those that you took. So that's why Indian slaves had to move from one place to another. So that's one characteristic, and one characteristic that certainly applies in the case of the residential schools. Mm-hmm. Second, once you get to the place of work, you cannot leave. And again, certainly that applies in the case of the residential schools. And these apply to many other ranches, mining camps, homes, those taken for domestic service. Third, there was a violence, or at least the threat of violence, in order to compel people to work. So again, in many instances, this applied. And fourth, there was no compensation, or at least nominal compensation, but the compensation was certainly well below market prices, market wages. So these 4 characteristics define what I call the other slavery. And so in that sense, I do believe that many of these schools that you're referring to are very properly could be considered under this rubric that I call the other slavery. Right. I mean, I think that speaks to one of the fundamental qualities of this other slavery, as I call it. I mean, I call it the other slavery, but it is more properly the slavery that we are dealing with even today. Mm-hmm. I mean, the other slavery should be the other one. African slavery should be the other slavery, because that was a little bit of an aberration, right? I mean, slavery that was legal, that was sanctioned by empires and nations around the world, and that's perfectly proper. That is an anomalous situation. What we see today is that in the vast majority of the world, slavery is prohibited, yet it happens on the ground with people who try to get around the law by multiple ways. And so this is exactly the experience that we are talking about. So that's one of the reasons why it is so hard to stamp out, to eliminate completely, because if you target a particular form of enslavement, so rightly you are saying that the American government in the 19th century outlawed, for example, peonage, which is the advancing of money to somebody in exchange for future work. And so indigenous workers were given money, then they were taken to ranches in New Mexico or in Utah or in northern Mexico or in southern Mexico and elsewhere, I mean, throughout the continent. And once they had incurred this debt, they could not leave the place where they were until they paid off the debt. But they had to eat and they had to be clothed, and so they oftentimes incurred more debt, and so they could not leave until for their lifetimes. And sometimes these debts were passed on to children who also inherited the debt. So peonage became the way in which these other slavery occurred. And so the American government passed laws in the 1860s, in 1867 in particular, abolishing or extinguishing peonage, which was a form of enslavement, obviously. And yet, as you say, at the same time, there were other ways emerged in which these traffic could still be conducted. So I'm not surprised. This is just why it is not just enough to prohibit some practice. Enforcement of or vigilance of these other forms of human trafficking needs to be ever present, and we need to be very mindful that these practices that extend until today are liable to change. People who benefit from these forms of human trafficking are very nimble. They are capable of targeting a different population. They are capable of changing the wording. They are capable of changing the mechanism and continue with these other slavery, as I call it. Well, so my book really gets up until 1900, so covers only the 19th century, and I do show, however, that that did continued even then, in spite of all these laws that we have been talking about, in spite of the Civil War, in spite of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. So in fact, some of the methodologies of the other slavery were applied to the South, to the newly liberated Africans in the South, in order to re-enslave them, as it is well known now. So it continues. So I don't know. So I don't know exactly how the story continues in the 20th century, but I do see that the mechanisms of enslavement to which Native Americans were subjected for 400 years resurface even today, exist today. And so that's why I do see the value in studying these other slavery, because it is the forerunner of what we are seeing now. Perhaps it has lost these tie to race. So these new forms of enslavement target anyone, and maybe it targets people with low socio-economic standing as opposed to a particular race. But the mechanisms hark back very clearly to these forms of bondage that we've been talking about today. I think this is the last point that we were talking about. It surprised me the most how I went back to the 16th, 17th century thinking that I would be telling a story that is, that it happened so long ago and it's over. And I think the most striking thing is to realize that it is, in a way, a phenomenon that still is with us. I didn't know, for example, I'm a professor at the University of California at Davis, which is close to Sacramento, which is the capital of California. And sparked by my interest in Indian slavery, I was interested in human trafficking. And to my complete surprise, I realized that Sacramento and this area and some further south in California are some of the hotspots of human trafficking in the United States. So again, I don't want to draw a one-to-one connection, but I do see that some of the mechanisms endure, and we just need to be vigilant. It's not a history lesson. It's something that is still with us, and that was very striking after finishing that book. Clearly, discrimination is a major part of the problem, and we see that it's not a historical phenomenon. It's something that remains until today. So for example, in the case of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery, but also involuntary service, involuntary work, formulation that should have applied to many forms of coercion of Native Americans in the West. And yet the Supreme Court of the United States, in a series of rulings in the 1870s, opted for a very narrow interpretation of this that enabled the survival of the system for decades. And as you may know, Native Americans were not granted full citizenship rights in the United States until the 1920s. So these discrimination clearly had an enormous impact on the survival of these other forms of slavery. So clearly, tackling discrimination and being aware of these history of discrimination is very important for the new generations to understand why discrimination is at the base of some of these terrible institutions that we've seen played out historically. Well, I mean, my experience, as a result of the book, I've been given talks, like I don't know, dozens of talks all over the United States and in other parts of the world as well. In many of these talks, I do run into Native Americans who, and in many instances, they tell me that finally somebody telling the story that we knew for so long or that we had been told, etc. So I don't think this is new to them. I think they know very well this story, but it is now coming to light for example, in these residential schools, in phenomenon, or in other venues. So I think it's a story that should be more widely known amongst non-natives. I think natives know about this story, but I think non-natives should be more aware that these other slavery also played out, and it was also a very big deal, not a marginal thing that occurred only in the 16th century and then disappeared. It was a very enduring, very important, and very tragic part of the continental story of the Americas.